Well, good afternoon in Kenai, morning, evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to our 15th week, the week of April 9th through April 15th, by my ciphering anyway. And fundamentally, we're looking at 2 Samuel, chapters 6 through 20. There are some snippets of 1 Chronicles in there as well, but at this point, we're really in 2 Samuel. I want to review briefly that in our last reading, David went to Hebron, and he became there the king of Judah, effectively Judah and Benjamin, kind of, after it seems like a fairly minor civil war. And in that passage that we read, there was a list of the children born to David while he was king in Hebron. One of those was Absalom, and I just mention this because it'll come up again as we go through our discussion here. And Absalom was born to one of David's several wives, Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. So here again, we find David and others marrying outside the tribe of Israel, which seems to be discouraged, but seems to be fairly common. And I would note also that at the end of our last reading, David did successfully capture Jerusalem and enslaved some of the Jebusites, and he brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. And it appears to me that he pretty much put it at Gibeah, the place that the Gibeonites were from. He hasn't built a temple yet, but it appears that the tabernacle must have been moved there from Shiloh. I'm not certain about that, but that's what I believe. So our reading this week begins with the dispute between Michal, who was Saul's daughter, and David. She was distressed because she felt that David, was an exhibitionist or something when he was prancing about celebrating the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. And David basically said, yeah, well, your dad, I was selected to replace your dad, neener, or something like that. And it appears, strangely enough, I didn't think that was a very good way for him to respond to that, but it sounds like he must have been in the right to some degree, because the outcome is that Michal remains barren for the balance of her life, which is typically something that happens in these circumstances because of God's approval of the other side, if you will. So, remember that Jonathan was killed, and so David, in our reading, makes good on his promises to Jonathan to be kind to his family, because remember, Jonathan was the son of Saul, and that's how he ended up being killed in the dispute that ultimately led to David's kingship. But David brings Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, to Jerusalem, and Mephibosheth will remain there, I believe we could safely say, through the rest of his life. So then, and this is an important passage, I think, God tells David through Nathan the prophet. Now, Nathan initially says, get after it. If you want to build a temple, make it so. But then God speaks to Nathan, and Nathan speaks to David and tells him that he is not to build a temple because he has too much blood on his hands. But his son, Solomon, will build the temple. So a lot of what we're going to read in the coming chapters will be discussion of David's preparations for the building of the temple. However, in our current reading, this moment in our reading, what is actually going on is that David is engaging in a series of wars to expand the kingdom, to actually make the kingdom include all of the lands promised by God to the Israelites, plus a little more. I mean, he's not quite satisfied with what God promised them. He wants a little more, or at least feels they should have a little more for security. And in one of the earlier fights in this routine of trying to overcome the surrounding nations, David was placed in serious danger while fighting the Philistines. And at that time, our passage says, "Then David's men swore to him, saying, 'Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished.'" So this is the start of some bad things, as it turns out. Nobody was ever reprimanded by God about this, but nonetheless, so the Philistines are defeated. Then the Arameans are defeated. With the Arameans under control, David then attacks Rabbah. Now, Rabbah is modern Amman, Jordan. I'd like us to look at our map here for just a moment. So where we are right now, David is no longer in Hebron. Hebron is here. Jerusalem is here. He is now in Jerusalem, and essentially he has gained control over all these colored areas. That is the areas that were effectively promised to the Israelites. Now notice that this yellow is Manasseh, the half-tribe on the east side of the Jordan River, and the half-tribe on the west side of the Jordan River. And notice here is Amman, Jordan. This is in Amman. What a surprise. This is in Amman. This is modern-day Jordan. And so he's out here disputing for this land, and later he takes Damascus up here in what is now modern Syria, which is Aram. So he is expanding the borders of the kingdom, which is not said to be a bad thing at any point in our reading. However, what transpires now that David has decided, or has been suggested, that he should not go out to battle, so now he's in Jerusalem while his troops are attacking Rabbah, with David sitting in Jerusalem. And of course, we well know the story that we're reading. David sees lovely Bathsheba bathing on the roof of her house, I guess. I don't know. She's married to Uriah the Hittite. And I would note to you that that's also interesting, because it strikes me that Uriah, being a Hittite, that is to say, a son of Heth, and Heth was the son of Canaan, who was the son of Ham, which means he is not of the Israel tribe at all, any of the Israel tribes at all. So I believe she was from that group. Bathsheba is, interestingly, mentioned but not exactly named in the Matthew list of Jesus's forebears. So now we have the third woman indirectly mentioned in the listing of the forebears of Jesus in the New Testament, and all three of them were non-Israelite women. I find that fascinating. In any event, David engages in adultery with Bathsheba. and tries to figure out a way to cover that up. He knows he shouldn't have done that, obviously. He actually later is very repentant about having done it. But nonetheless, that's what happened. He brings Uriah to the capital in the hope that he would go and spend the night with his wife. But he says, I can't do that because all the men are in the field fighting. I have to get back. So he doesn't join with his wife, and David effectively murders Uriah the Hittite by having the troops move him to the forefront as they attack the city and then fall back, leaving him under the walls to be killed. And that is, in fact, what happens. So then Nathan tells David the story about the rich man who slaughtered the poor man's ewe lamb to entertain a visitor. And David's response is quite interesting. When he's told this, his response to this is, if I can find it quickly, David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. Ouch. So what happens next? Well, we well know what happens next. First of all, I would note to you that David wrote a psalm, which is within our reading, Psalm 51. It is a moving plea for mercy, which I would suggest we can all learn from. We all need mercy from God. David fasts and prays and tries to get God to reverse the decision to have the child die, but in fact, the child does die. And then, now I'd like to read another brief passage in our reading. David resumes living at that point after the child has died. If I can find the passage quickly. His answer when the servant said, what? All this time you've been fasting and carrying on, and now the child is dead and you're back to normal? He answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. So that's a very moving story within our current reading. In any event, David, as I pointed out on our map, David defeated the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Arameans. All of them were ultimately captured by David. And so his kingdom has expanded well beyond the boundaries of what God promised. And I would note to you that dysfunctionality amongst these polygamous families is rampant. David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, and King David is furious, but the text says specifically he did nothing about it. And if memory serves me correctly, I believe rape is one of those capital crimes in the Code of Moses, so I'm a little puzzled about that. But nonetheless, so Absalom, Tamar's sister, is deeply offended by this event, and he manages to figure out a way to kill Amnon. So that's why I mentioned Absalom earlier, because he's going to show up continuously now for a while in your reading. So Absalom kills Amnon, and he flees, and David begins missing him. So 3 years later, a rapprochement is established between David and Absalom. That Absalom returns to Jerusalem. And then, so now Absalom is back in Jerusalem, and he's campaigning at the gates of the city about, well, if I were king, all these bad things wouldn't be happening. I would listen to everything everybody said, etc., which we've certainly seen some of that within our own political lifetimes. And 2 years after returning to Jerusalem, he conspires to overthrow David, and David is forced to flee the city. However, ultimately, as you'll read, David's supporters are victorious in what is yet another civil war, and Absalom is killed. So, and of course, this is all within the family. This is so tragic. I'm sure there must have been some Greek plays about this, or somebody's. Anyway, for a long time now, or the next week, we'll be reading about preparations for the temple, and we will begin a reading of David's Psalms. David was the author of many, not all, but many of the Psalms, and so our editor, F. LaGard Smith, has placed those Psalms in a group here that we'll be reading, I think, for the next 2 weeks, if I remember right. So I'm glad you're here. We're happy to be here, and it's a beautiful day in Kenai. It was, I think, 6 above at the house this morning, but nonetheless, quite pleasant. Thank you for joining us.